Hi everybody, welcome. This is our first episode of our Big Book Study Series. So during the series, we're going to be looking about how we can use a big book, the super foundational text, all AA, CA, NA, all anonymous programs. How can we use it as members of Al-Anon, as friends and family of alcoholics and addicts? And how can we use the big book to better understand the addict and better handle a loved one's addiction? So in this first episode, I just want to start with perhaps the most important part of the big book, to me, that being Bill's story. Bill's story is something that is completely timeless, holds about 1 billion different themes that are true for most every alcoholic, most every addict, and is generally just a story that draws empathy, that draws understanding, and I think is super, super, super valuable to understanding the addict, especially as members of Al-Anon. All right, let's begin with the start of Bill's story. So, Bill is this veteran who returns to his hometown of New England, and he discovers two things. He discovers a bunch of praise from the fact that he fought in the war, which is incredible, and he also discovers liquor. And he begins to drink relatively heavily, as do many veterans, despite the fact that he knows and acknowledges early in the chapter that drinking and alcohol may not be right for him, nor in his family, and that it could cause pretty adverse things in the future. And it actually begins the chapter with this omen of a tombstone of an alcoholic that Bill kind of reminisces on and remarks like, hey, I saw this, I knew the signs, I knew alcoholism could be bad, I knew alcohol could adversely affect me, but I started drinking anyway. And that's the story of, one, most people who drink, those who can healthily drink and those who don't, and also those who cannot healthily drink. They usually know the adverse side effects of drinking and what it could cause, but no alcoholic begins drinking thinking they're going to be an alcoholic. This is just simply true. Otherwise, theoretically, they wouldn't start drinking, right? And so then Bill, fueled by this praise, fueled by this liquor, becomes very involved in law and in business. Throughout law school, he almost actually fails because of his drinking. And so you have these early signs that he shouldn't be drinking, right? It's clearly already interfering with his personal life. But he has this feeling, this argument deep inside of him that it excites something good in him, that it excites certain qualities, right? This kind of Hemingway effect where you have these artists and they believe, oh, my drinking is facilitating these good things I'm doing, unless I should keep drinking, when in reality, it's tearing them apart. And they're doing these things in spite of drinking, not because of it, right? And so he has this kind of sense, despite the fact that he is facing adversity because of his drinking. He is almost failing out of law school. This happens. Congruently, he chooses to abandon law, and he becomes a broker on Wall Street right before the Great Depression, right? And he becomes involved in financial speculation, and good times, bad times, they come to alternate a little bit, which is the story of a lot of alcoholics. When drinking is good, it's great, and when it's bad, it's rock bottom, it's terrible. And his life fluctuates between good, great, bad, and terrible, and he continues with this kind of financial speculation. And then in the boom of the late 1920s, that preceded the Great Depression, success befalls Bill. Things go really well. He sees his peers, some of them not doing very well, but he's doing great. Meanwhile, his drinking worsens. He loses his friends, and his relationship with his wife similarly begins to show cracks. But he is financially successful. The beginning of many alcoholics' story, and even the end of some alcoholics' story, don't look like rock bottom. They may look like this, where you are financially stable, thriving in spite of whatever is happening with those around you, but cracks always start to show. usually with the people you love most, and he loses his friends. And his marriage starts to fade a little bit. It starts to show some cracks, and things only kind of get worse from here. Then Bill starts to play golf. A fun activity, but it's an activity that facilitates his drinking ultimately, which is something that characterizes a burgeoning alcoholic. Diving into activities that aren't necessarily only enjoyable but facilitate one's drinking. And that can be used to say, hey, look, I'm functional. I go golfing with my friends. I'm doing super well, when in reality, these things may be in service of the next drink. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, eventually the Great Depression hits. And he looks at people and he scoffs at those killing themselves because of financial hardship. He scoffs at those that are giving up simply because the market crashed. And yet he does something very similar in diving deeper into this alcoholism that he's been developing ever since he left the army and became a veteran. And so he mocks these people trying to kill themselves or killing themselves, but then proceeds to essentially do the same to himself inadvertently, and his drinking becomes worse and worse and worse, and things become extremely self-destructive for Bill, even more than they'd already been. Eventually, Bill, his finances don't really keep going very well, and him and his wife, they leave to Montreal to live with a well-off, quite generous friend. And once again, this is something that happens in the story of a lot of alcoholics, where there's some big break, something great happens, but Bill spoils it. His drinking goes even more out of control, and it catches up with him, and all this drinking, all this evasive behavior, it forces him and his wife to leave and live with his wife's parents, which, is something that for a college-educated veteran who was formerly very, very well off, it's something that's odd for them to have to do, and something that's quite devastating, and can be. Then the worst of the worst happens. We have 5 years of Bill being completely not sober. And we get one of the greatest, most quoted, most pivotal lines in the entire big book, that being, liquor ceased to be a luxury and became a necessity. Early on in the alcoholic's journey, usually alcohol is something that fuels friendship, it fuels interaction, it fuels having a good time, it fuels some pain, some inner anything being eased. But as an alcoholic advances, liquor, alcohol, whatever drug of choice, becomes something that is predestined to them even being alive. For a true full-blown alcoholic, alcohol is like the blood coursing through their veins. It's not this social lubricant, it's the lubricant of life. And Bill realizes this and notes it in the big book, which, looking back, is a great step. He knows he's an alcoholic. He knows it's bad. And he knows that liquor is something he's totally powerless over. He keeps trying to stop drinking after this. But each time, delirium tremens set in. The adverse effects of stopping alcohol and the mental tax and toll that it takes on one immediately always follow. And so at this point, Bill is not only mentally powerless, as he's admitted, he is totally and utterly physically powerless by himself. Without a higher power, without anything, he is powerless. This powerlessness is what defines an alcoholic. An alcoholic can have 1,000 different stories. An alcoholic can be born rich, can die rich. An alcoholic can be born poor, die poor, become rich as they are in the midst of their alcoholism. But the only thing that defines an alcoholic is powerlessness. To be an alcoholic is to not have hit rock bottom, though it often means that. To be an alcoholic, to be an addict, is simply to be totally and utterly powerless by oneself to deal with it and to stop. And at this point, that's where Bill's at. So, going on with the story, some great business opportunity arises with one of his friends, and Bill takes it and he completely squanders it. So, an opportunity that in the past would have reaped wonderful profit, wonderful things for his family, is now entirely squandered because of his relationship with alcohol at this point. Following this, Bill concludes for about the 100th time that he must stop drinking, and he goes cold turkey. And this lasts a few days. And Bill wakes up one day and doesn't even realize when he started drinking again, but knows it happened. The cycle repeats and repeats and repeats about 100 times, eliciting just constant remorse and guilt on the part of Bill. And at this point in his journey, he knows he needs to stop. He knows he's an alcoholic. He knows that it's hurting his family and his wife. And he remorses. He says, if only I could be better. I love them so much. I love this family of mine. I love my wife. And yet I cannot do anything to stop, but I must. But he can't alone. And so this is something that's super common too. Being an alcoholic, being addicted to something is not a result of faulty morality. Oftentimes people will look at their alcoholic husband, brother, sister, boyfriend, anything, and say, he must not love me, he must not care enough to stop. But this is never, almost never, of course, an issue. Powerlessness over alcohol is not a symptom of not being able to see the harm it's causing to everyone around you. It's being able to see the harm and not being able to do anything about it. That's what the true alcoholic is. And as members of Al-Anon, as friends and family of alcoholics and addicts, it becomes really hard to navigate this because we love this person, and as presumably non-alcoholics ourselves, we don't have the same relationship with addiction, and so it can oftentimes be hard to see how someone could not stop when they know it's harming someone they love in you, right? But this is a destructive way to think, quite frankly, because the alcoholic, once again, is a powerless individual, and we should meet their powerlessness with empathy. And to say, you don't love me enough and so you can't stop, you can't go clean, that's essentially like saying, you know people can drown in water, why are you drinking it still, right? It's not something that is doable for the alcoholic who has not found a higher power yet. So, this cycle continues for about 2 years for Bill, and doctor intervention begins, because every time he tries to stop, delirium tremens set in, and his body or his mind take over far before any meaningful period of sobriety can begin. Upon this doctor intervention, Bill's placed in multiple alcoholic treatment centers, hospitals, detox centers, things of these likes, and he learns very concretely that his will has been entirely weakened in the matter of liquor. He can have great will and work hard at many other things, financial speculation, being a good person, things along these lines, but liquor is not one of those things. When it comes to liquor, he is totally and utterly without power, and his will is weakened. His personality is not the same when he is drinking, and this is simply true for him. This insight clears things up, and Bill can get sober for a few months, which is a huge accomplishment, considering he's doing it by himself with no higher power, and yet it ends. It's not sustainable, and proclaimed by doctors, proclaimed by his wife, proclaimed by his family, and even by himself, Bill is entirely hopeless. He's tried 1,000,000 times to stop by his own accord. He has about 1,000 reasons to stop. He cares deeply about stopping, and yet it's not possible for him. This is the story of every alcoholic and addict ever at any point. Those who recover, those who don't recover, this powerlessness, this moment where you know you must stop and you know it's hurting those around you and yourself, but simply can't, is characteristic of the alcoholic. And as members of Al-Anon, we must know this. And we must not take it personally. So this is Bill's rock bottom. He proclaims during this chapter that alcohol was his master, and he simply a slave to liquor. So one day, a friend who had become sober, who had been in a situation similar to Bill's, reaches out and comes to see Bill. And Bill really only anticipates capturing the good old days, drinking with his friend. But when his friend comes, he is inexplicably different. And in the book, he describes it as he's a new man. There's a new glow to him. His skin is clearer, his eyes glimmer, everything is different about him. And he wonders why. And he quickly realizes that this is not going to be a normal meeting. So he sits down with his friend. His friend says that he has found religion. And Bill slyly proclaims that his gin, his liquor, will last longer than his friend's religion. And his friend then describes a program that gave him all this rejuvenation, helped him find his religion, helped him find a higher power. And Bill recounts his church experiences and essentially says, like, hey, I'm so glad this is working for you, but I'm not religious. I can't be. I've had bad experiences with the church. Religion is not my friend. God is not my friend. He's not on my side. Look at me clearly. I'm sorry that you think it would work for me, but it won't. And I'm glad it worked for you. And he's sitting there, an agnostic, and he's filled with so much anger about the church. But then Bill steps back for a sec, and he realizes that he's always had a greater power. Despite his relation with the church, despite his experiences throughout his life, he has had something greater than him, at least in theory. And so he thinks a little bit more and a little bit more. And he says, there's so much immutable law. There is physics. Gravity will always exist. When I jump, I will come back to the ground. There must be something greater. Without such a force, how could such an immutable law ever be true? And so he softens up. And he realizes that he believes in God, though not in a religious way. He's not Christian, he's not Buddhist, he's not Muslim, he's not Jewish, but he does believe in a higher power. He believes in a God, he believes in something greater than himself. But he also realizes that he may believe in a devil, much greater than a God, greater than him. And so he has this moment of cynicism where he's like, if there's a God, there must also be a devil much stronger, because look at the situation that I'm in. Bill's friend essentially responds to him saying, like, hey, I get it. I was similarly as hopeless as you at one point, but I sit here and I'm a miracle. Despite this, the word God in itself still excites anger in Bill, which is normal, by the way. And Bill's friend essentially sits there and says, that's okay. You can be afraid of God. The only thing necessary right now is that you believe in something greater than yourself, and that's it. And he says this and evokes this idea that, like, the only thing you need to get better is a complete willingness to surrender yourself to something bigger. It does not have to be Jesus. It doesn't have to be God. It does not have to necessarily be Allah or Buddha or something like this. It doesn't have to be organized. It just has to be some spiritual entity that you feel and that you truly believe in and that you believe is above you and is a higher power. That's all you need. And Bill's friend says this over and over. And finally, Bill realizes he's right. And in the coming days, in the coming weeks, he gives his life over to this higher power. And the way it's written is that he never drank again. And this is miraculous. It's amazing. And this happens. But I also must say, sometimes it takes a little bit. You can be entirely devoted to a higher power, to a God, to something bigger than you, and relapse. Recovery is not linear, and as members of Al-Anon, we have to remember that. Our loved ones who are addicts might not get better the first try. They probably won't, in fact. They might not get better the second or third or fifth try. But persistence is key, because eventually your relationship with that higher power, with your God, will be strong enough that it'll be okay. And you'll have gone through things so many times that you know how to respond. And so as members of Al-Anon, with a recovering family member, friend, loved one, must realize this. And ourselves must have higher power and say, hey, God's plan, our higher power's plan, the spirit in the sky's plan is going to work out. It's going to be fine. Because just as the alcoholic cannot recover without a higher power, we can't support them properly or be okay with the process of addiction and of addiction recovery without having a higher power. It's not reliable. And so to believe that our loved one can get better with the help of a higher power, we must elicit and employ the help of such higher power. Okay, so now the final portion of the video, the takeaways section. So looking at Bill's story, there's a lot of things that we can take away about the alcoholic and the addict. Principally, education is not always enough, unfortunately. Bill knew that alcohol could kill him. He was at least vaguely aware of this whenever he began drinking, and yet addiction took over his life. Secondly, from the very beginning of his drinking, of his alcoholism, even whenever it was in the most basic fledgling state, it was badly affecting his life. He nearly fails out of law school because of it, but he still keeps drinking. At this point, he hasn't realized his own powerlessness over it. He hasn't given himself to a higher power. And so this realization, which may send some non-alcoholics to be like, hey, let me stop drinking so I can do this thing that I'm really wanting to do, it doesn't do that for him, because he's an alcoholic and he hasn't given his life up to a higher power and realized that he's powerless yet. Thirdly, brief success happens. During Bill's alcoholism, alcoholism isn't linear, like I said before, and it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. Not every alcoholic becomes poor, becomes homeless, destroys their life before finding this God. They often do, but they don't have to. It would have been totally reasonable if he had the resources for Bill at this moment, in momentary success, to realize that he was powerless to alcohol. It would have been a thing that was possible, and he could have began recovery at the top of the mountain. Rock bottom often precedes recovery, but it's not required. And to be an alcoholic, one must not have had a rock bottom. It's not a requirement. It's not a prerequisite to calling yourself an alcoholic and walking through the doors of AA asking for help. And as members of Al-Anon, we should know this and be able to recognize when a loved one may be an alcoholic, even though things are going okay. And being able to have those red flags go off once again when things are okay. Another takeaway. Bill tried to stop a lot of times. He tried to stop alone by his own willpower. A willpower that was strong for other things. That was motivated and really good at a variety of activities, but terrible at dealing with liquor. This is something that happens with most alcoholics, and it's not something we should fault them on. If they're trying to do it alone, it's nearly impossible. Next, Bill was a religious skeptic. He was a spiritual skeptic even. He had been burned by the church, just as so many of us had and have. And I think a big important thing to take away from this is like AA, anonymous programs, the steps, the big book, it's not a religious program. You can be an agnostic. as we'll talk about in a later video, you can be God afraid, God hurt, and you can be okay. So if you have a higher power and a loved one who is an addict and you know is an addict do not fear. If you truly believe in said higher power, you can believe that it will be okay. And this person can develop a higher power even though they may be an agnostic and a self-proclaimed atheist, but nobody really is, right? Not even Bill. Finally, Bill only recovered when he gave his life to a higher power and realized that he himself alone was powerless. This is the second step, but perhaps the most pivotal one in beginning your recovery. First one must realize there is a problem, and second, they must realize they are powerless over said problem. And us as members of Al-Anon must realize that we ourselves are also powerless in helping the addict recover if they themselves do not have a higher power. The only thing we can do is steer them in the right direction, but crying out to them, "You don't love me if you don't get better," is not productive. Though it hurts so bad, and it's hard not to do that, we must not. And I think that is perhaps the biggest takeaway from Bill's story, is what an alcoholic is, what an addict is, and what is completely necessary in recovery. Thank you. I will be posting soon again, and I really appreciate you watching. Comment down below if there's anything you found really cool from the video, and drop a like if you want to support the channel. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Bye.